Hello, and welcome to our Exploring the Bible Series 4 class on David's friends and foes. This is class 7, and we're looking at a character tonight who maybe you're not so familiar with. His name's Hushai, and we've entitled this one, A Friend in Need. We're going to be looking basically at 2 Samuel 15, 16, and 17. These are the chapters, the events in which Hushai appears. And we're reminded of these verses. I've put two verses together here on the slide from Proverbs 17 and 18, chapter 17, verse 17, and chapter 18, verse 24. A friend loves at all times, and there is a friend who sticks closer to a brother. And Hushai, in the incident that we're looking at tonight, if you remember from last week when we were looking at Absalom and Ahithophel, we read about him and find out about him in the midst of this time when David's own son is rebelling against him, and his good friend and counselor Ahithophel has turned against him as well. And it's into this context that Hushai comes. And I think the interesting thing is that you will find that Hushai is actually called David's friend in the scriptures. And that is something that is not said about anybody else. So he certainly is a friend of David in the midst of this time when David is beset by many foes. Now, I'll remind you that these seminars, we're looking at how to read the Bible effectively for ourselves. That's really our goal, to look at context and repeated words, to listen for echoes, to put ourselves in the story, and to draw lessons. And I think we'll see that is accomplished in today's study. So if you have your Bible open, you might want it open to 2 Samuel 15. And we'll slide in and around where we've been from last week into this week, and look at Hushai, a friend of David in his time of perhaps greatest need. Now, you'll recall that our goal here with this particular series, David's Friends and Foes, is not to specifically look at David, but at how he is influenced and affected by those around him. However, we're going to start looking at David specifically. So here we are. If you'll remember in chapter 15, it opened with Absalom, and from here on in, it's Absalom, 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 Absalom. From several chapters, Absalom is the central figure of this story, and he conspires with Ahithophel, and they come against his father. And here we'll pick up the story in verse 23. It says, "And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over." So David is fleeing the city. It's thought that his goal was to protect the city. If Absalom was going to try and take over, David was abandoning the city, giving it up to Absalom. There would be no battles in the city. There'd be no siege. He just left it. And this made people sad. And it says all the country wept. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over. And you can see we've got it here on the screen. They crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. In verse 30, we read, "So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up, and he had his head covered and went barefoot, and all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up, weeping as they went." Now we're going to come back to the verses in between 23 to 30 there later, but you'll see that basically David chose not to have the ark come with him. Now, this was his response to Absalom's treason. He flees the city, and he takes many people with him. And we have an incredible echo here to the Lord Jesus Christ, of course, David's greater son. And so we have here in John chapter 18, verse 1, Jesus, when he had spoken these words, so we have that long section when Jesus is speaking to his disciples and praying to God about his disciples. So he finished those words. He went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron. So David's experience here, he's really walking in the footsteps of the Messiah. He's leaving Jerusalem, he's crossing the brook Kidron, and he's going up to the Mount of Olives. This is exactly what Jesus did. There was a garden there. Matthew 26, verse 30 and 38 tell us that after they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So you put the two together, Jesus crosses the brook Kidron and goes up to the Mount of Olives. And he's sorrowful, just as David was. Earlier, Jesus had looked over the city. Now, this is not in sequence here in Luke 19. This is earlier, but Jesus had looked over the city and wept over it. He knew what was coming. And so the experiences of David here and the experiences of Jesus are interlinked. And we mentioned that last week, of course, with the betrayal that David would have felt, with Ahithophel paralleling the betrayal of Judas. And this just emphasizes that even more. And so in this case, it's an echo forward to the life of Jesus, but that now allows us to reflect upon David and his experiences as kind of a backward echo. And we can now rethink about the incidents that we're reading here in chapter 15 and 16, and we can really see that this was David's Gethsemane. And that is, we can link these, crossing the Kidron, going up to Gethsemane, is really something we can all experience. We know for Jesus, it was a thy will be done, not mine, as he struggled with what he was being called to do. And so David had these experiences, and we put ourselves in that story. We can see that we are going to have those experiences as well. So here, we said we'd get back to this. We left off we would jump from 23 to 30. Well, in between, the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, bring out the Ark of the Covenant with the priests, and David sends them back to the city. He doesn't take the Ark with him, which is really interesting. It's almost as though he's not that presumptuous, that he assumes God's going to go with him. Now, he must know in his heart that's true, and that what Absalom is doing is wrong, but he's not going to be presumptuous about it. There's a bit of a struggle. So this is his Gethsemane. What is God going to do with him? And so he says here in verse 26, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, perhaps he'll bring me back. And he concludes this. He's willing to accept that maybe this is the end, that he's going to go and flee, and he will no longer be king. He's going to leave it up to God. And so he says of God, here I am, let him, the Lord God, do to me as seems good to him. He's saying this as he's crossing the Kidron and going up the Mount of Olives, if you will, to Gethsemane. Well, we know very clearly, you'll remember what Jesus says in the garden after having crossed the brook Kidron with his disciples. These two records are in parallel. He says, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And so this was Jesus' experience, and David is experiencing these same things. So that little aside is just a good connection always to see David and what we can learn from David walking in the footsteps of the Messiah, experiencing the same things: betrayal, grief, sadness, questioning, if you will, even contending with God. If I find favor in his eyes, your will be done, not mine. These kinds of things we can take on board for ourselves when we're perhaps in a difficult or a struggling situation. So picking up the story then, back here in verse 31 now of 2 Samuel 15. So we've got that context. David's come out of Jerusalem. He's leaving the city wide open to Absalom. He wants the city protected. He's weeping. The people with him are crying. He's sent the ark back. He's basically saying, if God finds favor in me, he'll bring me back. And he's distressed. And at this very moment, we referred to this verse in our last session, but didn't look it up. It's right here, 2 Samuel 15, verse 31. Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. It was bad enough that it was his son, but now he finds his very good friend, his close confidant, his counselor, as we saw last week, was amongst those who were conspiring against him. And David prays, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And we saw last week that Ahithophel's counsel was anything but foolishness. David, in the record, Hasn't even got these words out of his mouth. He hasn't even taken a breath yet. And we keep reading. And it says in verse 32, now it happened. Now when it happened, and this is biblical language for God being in control, providence at work. It's not random. That was our point last week. Events in our lives are not random. It happened when David come to the top of the mountain where he worshiped God. He's praying, he's saying this prayer, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. If things seem to be going against me, Absalom's getting it all his way. He's got my counselor on his side. Here I am fleeing. I'm on the other side of Jordan. I'm up in this mountain. And right at that moment, there was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. If you have your Bible open and you like making notes into your Bible, you can write right beside that verse, Hushai is an answer to David's prayer. It's that immediate. David had just prayed, oh Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel to foolishness. The next thing he knows, there's Hushai. And he's mourning. He's got his clothes torn. He's so sad and so upset for David. He's an answer to prayer. Do we see God working in our lives in that way? Not in a presumptuous way. We saw that David wasn't presumptuous. He sent the ark back. He wasn't presuming upon God's favor. But he prayed, and this was the next event. And David leaps right into it. He sees Hushai as an answer to prayer. So let's keep reading. Verse 33, David said to him, if you go with me, you'll become a burden to me. Now, this may sound very harsh language, and maybe some of you don't understand this kind of bantering between friends. I believe that's exactly what this is. This shows the depth of their friendship. That they could say what might appear mean, and some people listening on might be, oh, that's a bit harsh, to say to Hushai, I don't want you coming with me because you'll just be a burden. But when you understand how close their friendship was and how excited David was to have Hushai with him, and he's got a plan. We'll see that momentarily. He's got a plan. That this is what he says to his friend Hushai in a jesting way. I think especially some of the guys listening will understand that. This is the way sometimes guy friends show their love and affection to each other with sometimes what words might seem harsh or bantering or maybe even physical punching or slapping or whatever it might be. This is what's going on here. Now, just to verify that, David and Hushai were friends. Don't misunderstand that. Verse 37 of this chapter, Hushai, David's friend. And in chapter 16, again, it calls him David's friend. And Absalom even acknowledges it. We'll see in a moment. Absalom says to him, this is a funny way to treat your friend. Come back and leave him out there in the wilderness and come to me, the usurper. He was known to be David's friend. Now, this word friend, if you look up the word friend, it basically means friend. There's not much there. But if you dig a little bit deeper, and sometimes we need to do that when we see some keywords and we're looking it up in our concordances, we might need to dig a little deeper. And sometimes it's not the word, but the word it comes from. So you need to make that one extra step in your concordance study. It's from a root word, ra, or something like that, which basically means to tend a flock. And Strong's in his concordance says, it means to pasture or to graze, literally or figuratively. So it's a widely, extensively used word. But in this context of friendship, it's that association. It's like fellowship. It's like hanging out together, just grazing, just hanging out. That's the closeness of their friendship. And I think it's important for you to understand that this word is only used of David and Hushai twice. And here in 1 Chronicles 27, verse 33, Hushai is called the king's companion. But this word friend is used only of David and Hushai, and then also of Solomon and a friend of his who happened to be Nathan's son. It's only used those 3 times, which gives you an indication of how rare and special it is. I think I have that verse in the notes that are also available. As we've always mentioned, these slides are available, and there's also some notes that go into more detail on some of these things that we can't cover all the details in our video. And so here in 1 Chronicles 27, Hushai the Archite is called the king's companion. Now, the reason I highlighted this verse is just have a look at this. 1 Chronicles 7 is kind of listing, the key people in the nation, in the power structure of the nation. And in the same verse, Ahithophel and Hushai are linked. Now, we're going to see this time and time again in 2 Samuel 15, 16, and 17. It's this battle, or this contest, if you will, between Ahithophel and Hushai, who both were dear to David, who both were close companions, but one turned on him. Ahithophel, as we saw last week, perhaps out of just holding a grudge of what David did with Bathsheba. And now Hushai is going to stay loyal to him. And so we're going to see this battle begin here. So David immediately has a plan. And again, put yourself in the story. Think about this and think of it now from Hushai's perspective. He's gotten the news. He wasn't there when the news came out and David had to flee the city. He's come late, and he's just beside himself. He tears his clothes, he puts sackcloth and ash on his head, and he tries to find out where the king's going, and he runs ahead. And so that when David comes over Kidron, up the Mount of Olives, and just over the top of the mountain, there's Hushai. He's there waiting for him. He's just devastated. So they have this little bantering thing. I'm sure they hugged, whatever they did in those days. David is just jesting thing like, oh, you can't, I don't want you hanging out here with me. You'd just be a burden to me. And you know what Hushai said back, who knows? There was some bantering. But then David launches right into this. But if you return to the city and pretend to be Absalom's servant, say to him, I'll be your servant as I was in your father's. I'm going to be your friend now, Absalom. He says to Hushai, and this is David speaking to Hushai. He says, if you go back to the city, maybe you can defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. Now, we might just read over that, but remember what we learned last week? Ahithophel's counsel was like as if someone was had the oracle of God. His counsel, his advice was so wise and so prudent and so timely that really there wasn't any better. That's what David is asking Hushai to go back and defeat. This is a big ask. This is something you would only ask like a really, really close friend. He goes on to say, and David, this is an answer to his prayer. And he's concocted this plan almost instantaneously. And you can hear the words just spilling out. Oh, and Hushai, you won't be all alone. I've sent back Zadok and Abiathar. They're there. And, if you hear something in the king's house, you can tell Zadok and Abiathar. They'll tell their sons. They'll get the message to me. He's asking Hushai to be a double agent, to go back and pretend to be on Absalom's side, but all along be a spy for David. And he's asking him two things: defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, that's a big ask, and to spy on him. If you hear something, their plans, what they're going to do, get that word to Zadok and Abiathar, and they'll somehow get it to me. You can send me everything you hear. This is incredibly dangerous situation. And we don't know what Hushai had in mind. We get the idea that he was wanting to stay with David and go with David, hence the, if you come with me, you're going to be a burden to me. And there must have been lots of people flocking to David. Some he sends back, some he keeps with him. He's having to make decisions on the fly here. But he sees Hushai, his very, very, very dear friend, as a key. He can go back. He can pretend to be a counselor for Absalom, get in on the, be there at the inner circle, hear the war plans, and repeat that information to David. This is incredible. And we keep reading. That was, David's just, these words are just tumbling out of him. And what's the next verse? Verse 37, 2 Samuel 15. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came to Jerusalem. Now you got to understand what's going on here. Put yourself in the picture. Hushai has got torn clothes. He's disheveled. He's got sackcloth and ashes. And David says, you got to hurry back to the city. He had to get there before Absalom got there, because otherwise that would look really weird. The plot would be, definitely uncovered. He's got to pretend that he's been there waiting for the new king. He's got to change his clothes, got to like wash up. He's got to look like he's had nothing. He's never left the city. And look at this timing. He comes into the city and Absalom comes to Jerusalem. It's that close. It's nip and tuck. This is all there's a sense of urgency here. And did you notice that from the time we met Hushai at the top of the mountain where David was worshiping and praying until now, in the record, he hasn't said a single word. It's incredible. He's listened to David and he's acted on that plan. We've seen this before, haven't we, with David and Jonathan? Do you remember some of the plans that they made? And David would have this elaborate plan about, and having to deceive Saul and pretend he wasn't there and get a sense of what Saul was thinking. And Jonathan just did that at risk to himself. Remember, he had a javelin thrown at him. This is that nature. Hushai is of that significance. He's that level of friendship. What kind of friend are we? We need to be good listeners if we're going to be good friends. And sometimes we just need to do what the other person asks us to do, even if we're not so sure about it, and even if it's going to potentially be dangerous for us. We have to think of others first. We have to put others' needs above our own. This is Hushai. Incredible friendship here. He doesn't protest. He doesn't say, "Whoa, David, you're asking a lot of me. You want me to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel? You got to be kidding me. That guy's smart. That guy's got it figured out. I can't do that." He doesn't complain. He doesn't say, "Why don't we wait a little bit? Just think about this," And he just acts. He must have rushed back to the city, changed his clothes, washed up, and been sitting and ready so that when Absalom arrives, there he is. Now, we'll pick up the story there. Just a slight aside here, another little digression in the record. Because you might have noticed in chapter 15 that someone else comes, and it's a man named Ittai. And let's just pick this up. It's here in verse 18. It says, the king went forth and the people, in verse 17, and all his servants passed over with him, the Cherethites, the Pelethites, the Gittites, 600 men which came from him from Gath, passed over for the king. Now, don't read over those two verses too quickly. We're talking about a bunch of Gentiles, Philistines, ex-enemies of David, who are now going with him out of the city. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, he must have been their leader, in verse 19, "Why are you going with me? I'm almost not the king anymore. You're going to risk your life for me? Return to your place. Abide with the king. If you're loyal to the throne, there's a new king. It's Solomon. It's Absalom." We're not sure what David's thinking here, but he's telling Ittai to take the men and go back. You're a stranger here. You don't have a connection here to me, really. You're a foreigner. You're a Philistine. You're an exile. You're just new to you're new to the party. A little bit of jesting here. It's like you just came yesterday. I can't ask you to risk your life for me. Take your brother and go back. Mercy and grace be with you. Now, these were men from Gath, and yet they're loyal to David. They're Philistines. And I couldn't help but think of this proverb here, Proverbs 16, verse 17, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. David tells him to return with his men and serve the new king. I don't think he was testing his loyalty. I throw that out as a suggestion here. I think it's probably more like the Hushai thing. There's a bit of bantering here, a little bit of jesting. Surely you don't want to stay with me. Just go back to the city. Now, there should be some serious echoes going on in your head here. Return, go back to your people, your country. Are you getting some echoes? Well, if not now, maybe when Ittai responds. Verse 21. Ittai answered the king and said, "As the Lord lives, and as my soul the king lives," I only know one king, not the usurper back in Jerusalem. I'm staying with my king. That's you, David. "In what place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there shall thy servant be." Do you hear the echo? Where you go, I will go. Where you abide, I will abide. Your God will be my God. Your people, my people. Where you die, I'm going to die, David. I'm not leaving. I'm not going back. And of course, these echo the words of Ruth. And Ruth, of course, was David's great-grandmother. And David had taught Ittai and his men the truth. He'd led them to the God of Israel and probably told them this story when they said, how can we become into the belief system of the Jews? And David would have said, my great-grandmother was Moabite. And that's what she said. And David is now hearing those words repeated back to him from this faithful man, Ittai. Just warms your heart. And so David, it's in very few words. Verse 20, David said to Ittai, go and pass over. He's probably crying at this point, weeping with emotion and filled with emotion. So Ittai and the Gittites passed over, and all his men and their little ones that were with him there. They brought their whole families. They weren't going to leave David. They were going to stand by his side, and they're going to play a role in David's return. Just a real heartwarming story in the midst of this betrayal and this treason and all these negative things. God's sending these beautiful little packages to David, and there's more to come. We'll see before we finish the class today. But back to the story picks up now. We'll click over to chapter 16. There's some other stuff that goes on. We dealt with that with Shimei and some of the cursing of David. So we find out more. David gets all his family, and they get over the Jordan, and they're safe on the other side. And then verse 15 of chapter 16 here picks up the story with Absalom. It says, meanwhile, Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. And who was waiting? Hushai was there. He got himself cleaned up. It looked like he'd never left. And so it was when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom, long live the king, long live the king. Now, of course, you can take these words two ways. In his mind, Hushai is probably thinking of the exiled king, but he's got to sell Absalom that he's sincerely now following him. Absalom, the new king that was being proclaimed throughout the country. Remember, that was the plan. When you hear the trumpet say Absalom reigns in Hebron, maybe remember the ruse that he had made to go down to Hebron to fulfill a vow. And now he's made his way from Hebron up to Jerusalem, and he got in just after Hushai, and they're now setting up shop. And later we're going to see we talked about last week, the thing with David's concubines and so on is coming. So Absalom and Ahithophel and the men of war are going to set up shop in Jerusalem and take over the kingdom. So Absalom says to Hushai, he's a bit taken aback. He says, is this your loyalty to your friend? He's talking about King David, his father. Why didn't you go with your friend? Everyone knows that Hushai and David are we might say today, joined at the hip. They're good friends. They grazed together. They hung out together. They had fellowship. This was the kind of friendship they had. It was renowned. Hushai, I don't know how he pulled this off. David must have known that he could, and he must have prayed for him, and Hushai must have prayed, and God must have been acting. We know that to be the case. But look, this is what Hushai says to Absalom. No, but to whom the Lord and his people and all the men of Israel choose, his will I be, and with him I will remain. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in your father's presence, so will I be in your presence. That's what he says in verse 19. And Absalom buys it for now, because the very next verse he turns to Ahithophel and says, okay, Ahithophel, let's get on with business. What's your counsel? And he has the counsel about the concubines and getting all the men of war on his side. And it's going to lead into what we finished with last week with Ahithophel's counsel to go and slay David immediately, not hold back. So just remember, Hushai here, his life is in jeopardy. If he's found out, if someone said, hey, just a second, I saw Hushai fleeing Jerusalem with, ashes on his head, and then he came back, and, I think he had some dealings with your father. Hushai's life is over. Absalom's got no time for this. He's literally risking his life for his friend David, and he pulled it off. Now, the story then picks up in chapter 17. Remember, we ignore the chapter break. So Hushai has endeared himself to Absalom, at least temporarily. Absalom in chapter 15, verse 20, turned to Ahithophel. What's your counsel? That's given. Absalom does that. It's all going his way. And of course, it ends, chapter 16 ends, chapter 16, verse 20, ends with a comment on how amazing Ahithophel's counsel was. It was as if someone was, had the ear of God. That's how wise he was. And so we finished last week, the last session with verses 1 to 4 of chapter 17. Basically, Ahithophel says, look, I got a plan. I'm going to leave right away. Let's not mince words. I'm taking the army with me. We'll go out. We'll find David. We'll slay him. I'm only going to kill David. The rest, everyone else will flee. The kingdom's yours. That's his plan. Verses 1 through 4. And we know God's at work. Verse 4 of chapter 17, the saying pleased Absalom well, and all the elders of Israel are like, this guy Ahithophel, he's got it on. He's got it going here. This is brilliant. Strike while the iron's hot. David's weak. He's fleeing. Everyone's crying. There would have been, reports of them leaving with, their heads down, and they fled all the way over Jordan. Let's strike while the iron's hot. It's over. This is great, great advice. But for some reason, and we know the reason, God put it in Absalom's mind in verse 5 of chapter 17. Then said Absalom, call now Hushai the Archite also. I want to know what he has to say. Can you imagine? They call for Hushai. And Hushai thought, boy, this is the moment I've been praying about. He's probably been on his knees in prayer the entire time. He knows his friend David is counting on him. His heart would have been in his mouth. What's Absalom going to say? So verse 6, when Hushai was come to Absalom, Absalom spake to him and said, this is the counsel that Ahithophel's given. And he repeats, the plan to go right after David right away and wipe him out immediately. We think it's a pretty good idea, but what do you think? If you don't think that's a good idea, tell me what idea you got. You got something better, Hushai? We want to hear it. Hushai said to Absalom, listen to these words. And he might have had some sort of idea of what he could have said or what counsel he could have given. He may have been able to script this a little bit ahead of time, but I'm thinking that he's just praying earnestly that God gives him the right words. Have you ever been in those situations where someone confronts you with something or maybe questions you on something, asks you a reason of the hope that is within you, and you're just like, I don't know what to say. And you just pray for God to give you words? I think that's what Hushai is. So listen to his verse words. The counsel that Ahithophel had given is not good at this time. Can you imagine that? You could have heard a pin drop. Ahithophel would have given him a withering glance. The elders would have been, this should be interesting. Ahithophel counsel's not good. Wow, that'll be a first. For Hushai said, and just read this, put yourself in that room, in that circle of elders, having heard what Ahithophel said, knowing Absalom and his pride and his character. I think at best, Hushai thinks, I got to buy David a bit of time. I got to give him some time. For, said Hushai, you know your father and his men, they are mighty men, and they be chafed in their minds. They're like a bear robbed of her whelps. You don't come between a mama bear and her whelps, her cubs. You don't do that, Absalom. Your father's a man of war. He's not going to lodge with the people. You might follow Ahithophel's counsel and go after him. You won't even be able to find him. He's hidden somewhere. He's not going to be exposed. She had no idea whether this was true. Last time he'd seen David, things looked pretty grim. Behold, he's now hid in a pit somewhere or some other place. When we go over, immediately David's men are gonna fight back. A few of your men are gonna die. And anyone who hears it is gonna say, okay, we've heard this story before. There's a slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. This is your dad's track record, Absalom. Come on. You know him. And he also is a valiant, and he also that is valiant of heart, has the heart of a lion. It's going to melt all these valiant men that Ahithophel's going to take with him. What did he say he was going to take? Like 12,000 of them there? That's not going to be enough. their hearts are going to melt. All Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those that are with him are valiant men. So he goes against the counsel of Ahithophel and says, look, at this moment, not a good idea. Ahithophel's got it wrong. And then he's got to come up with a plan. It's not just any good saying what the other guys counsel why that it's not good. You got to come up with a replacement plan. And this is just amazing. I just love reading this. You've got to put yourself in the story. I think Hushai must have been a great actor. He must have been a great orator. And David must have known that. He's probably thinking, I can see what Hushai is going to do. He's going to go to town on Absalom. Listen to this. Listen what he says here. It's just filled with hyperbole. He's playing on Absalom's pride. Ahithophel had said, look, Absalom, you stay here. I'll take care of this, because it was all about him. Hushai's like, no. Absalom, this is you. You want to make this right. You want to do this big time. Listen to it. Verse 11. This is Hushai's counsel to Absalom. Therefore, I counsel that all Israel be generally gathered to thee. Not just 12,000. That's not enough. That's not big enough for you, Absalom. From Dan to Beersheba, as the sand which is the sea by multitude, that thou mayest go into battle in thine own person. Absalom, you got to lead this thing. You're going to be an ex-king. Don't let Ahithophel do your dirty work. It's all about you, Absalom. See, he's playing him up. And we're going to gather such an army. It's like the sand of the sea. We're just going to listen to this. We'll come upon him in some place, verse 12, where he's found. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where he's hiding. There's no hiding place from us, Absalom. We will light upon him as dew that falls on the ground. There will be no stone left unturned. And of him and all the men that are with him, there will be left not so much as one. We're going to wipe them all out, Absalom. Clean slate. Start fresh. You and your men, all Israel. Let's go get him. He's going now. Hushai is going. He's probably seeing the sparkle in Absalom's eye and thinking, I got to reel him in. He's taking the bait. I got to reel him in. Moreover, if he be gotten into a city, if he thinks he can hide in a city, Absalom, no way. We're going to get all Israel. We're going to have so many. Our army's going to be so big. We'll just get ropes. We'll just draw that city into the river. He's gone over the river to hide. We're just going to drag that city into the river. There's not going to be one stone left of that city. Wow. What a dramatic performance. Hushai has just given an Oscar-rated performance here. He has just won the day. Look at this, verse 14. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. Hushai must have thanked God for those words. Now, it's clearly told us in verse 14 there that the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. His counsel was good. Hushai had to defeat it with God's help because he wanted to bring evil upon Absalom. Wow. And so we have this verse here that Solomon penned years later. There are many devices in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the counsel of the Lord, that shall stand. Ahithophel had big plans. He might have just missed it there. He might have overdone it with him all being about him in those first 4 verses. And Absalom had great plans, but it was all going to go according to the plans of God. Now, the interesting thing is, we'll get back to this later. Hushai's like, gets out of there. He's got to get a message to David, and there's all kinds of things that happen there. We'll read about that. And he gets looked after. The people, he gets the message to David. They number the people. They kind of organize their army. And it would seem to me that Absalom didn't even wait. He didn't really even follow Hushai's counsel to the letter. The key thing for Absalom was he wanted to lead the charge. And so he goes out in verse 6 of chapter 18. The people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim, and so on. And Absalom is eventually killed. There's a slaughter amongst the people of Absalom, just like Hushai had predicted if they'd followed Ahithophel's counsel. And it goes David's way, and he returns in glory. So just amazing. Now, the end of chapter 17 here, David is just finding friends after friends after friends. And we've talked a little bit about this with Barzillai and Maker. We talked about that Maker didn't hold a grudge, even though he was Bathsheba's brother. They were providing what David needed. But even before we get there, you remember what David had said to his friend Hushai: you got to defeat Ahithophel's counsel, and you got to get word back to me. What's going on? And so he does that. And so verse 15 of chapter 17, Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar, this is what Ahithophel said. This is what I said. I'm not sure which way it's going to go, but the king's in danger. He's got to, don't stay in the plains. Get out, get away, make ready. War is coming. So Jonathan and Ahimaaz in verse 17. So the message, Hushai somehow gets it to the priests. The priests get it to their sons. And this message is going out to David. And there's this friendship, this network of friends that David has. They're trying to get away, but someone sees them and reports to Absalom. So Absalom sends after them. There's this message that it says in the King James. It says this message was transmitted to Jonathan and Ahimaaz by a wench, just a maidservant, a nobody. But she was special in God's eyes. She was special in David's eyes. There was all kinds of people that were on David's side, if you will. And so, as Jonathan and Ahimaaz are fleeing, they're getting chased. So they find this woman who's a friend of David's in verse 19. She's been doing some stuff with grain. They go down her well. She puts the cloth over the well. We get some echoes here to Rahab, who's also in the line of Christ. She hides the spies, as it were, puts the grain covering over the well with the grain on it. The soldiers come and say, where's Jonathan and Ahimaaz? And she's like, oh, I think they went that way. And anyway, all these people helping out David. And then they get to Mahanaim. David gets to Mahanaim in verse 24. And all these friends come. We've looked at this before in verse 27. Shobi, who was an Ammonite, Maker, who was Bathsheba's brother, and Barzillai the Gileadite. All these people are providing for David, and they're providing just temporal things: food, shelter, clothing. And we think of this verse here in 1 John 3. If we have our worlds good and we see our brother of need and shut up our bowels of compassion, how dwells the love of God in him? Okay, if we love one another, we need to love it in word and in deed. And sometimes it's just providing a listening ear. Sometimes it's providing a meal. Sometimes it's providing a place of shelter. Ultimately, our goal is to bring them God's word for sure, but we might, in the process, need to help them just with filling their stomach. And so we see here, David had established this goodwill amongst people. There was a pay it forward kind of attitude, this cycle of good works, not a cycle of grudge and revenge. That was Absalom's way of doing things. That was Ahithophel, not these people that are helping David through this. And as we just wrap up our session, you can read through chapter 18 at your leisure. It goes well for David's army. Absalom dies. Ahithophel commits suicide. He knows that once his counsel wasn't being followed, they'd given David time to regroup. He knew it was over, and he felt that he couldn't ever redeem himself to David. He didn't think about asking forgiveness. He just took his own life. But we've been talking about Hushai tonight. Hushai is not ever mentioned again. We don't ever hear of him again. He gives the counsel to Absalom. He buys David time. He gets the message to David through the priests and their sons and the woman that helps out. David readies himself for war. He organizes the army. The people tell David to stay behind. They go out and fight the battle. It's over. They go get David. David's brought into Jerusalem. His throne is restored. Hushai is not mentioned again in the record. I'm sure that he and David did see each other, and David thanked him for what he did, and they reminisced, and he probably told him the story 100 times over. And David said, "What? You said that? Tell me again." I'm sure that all happened. But from the record, he's disappeared. He played his role and faded from the scriptural record, content to know that he had served his king and his friend. What's our attitude when we serve our king and our friend, the Lord Jesus Christ? when we do unto others as we would have do unto us, when we serve the least of Christ's brethren as if we were serving him, do we need acknowledgement and praise? Do we need the pat on the back? Do we need our name placarded here and there? No. Do we need to be recognized and congratulated? I would suggest no. And I can't help but think, you'll remember if you were with us in our third series on parables unique to the Gospel of Luke, we looked at this. I had this very slide on there. We looked at Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan. You remember that Jesus had been asked by the lawyer who was willing to justify himself, who is my neighbor? Jesus told the parable. And we said he was asking the wrong question. Because the question is, who was the neighbor to the one that fell among thieves? So the encouragement, the lesson, the takeaway from Hushai is be that friend, be that neighbor, be like Hushai. Don't expect anything in return. It's not about being compensated for what we've done. It's about doing the right thing to help out other people. That's the lesson. That's the big takeaway from Hushai, even at the risk, potentially, of our own lives. So I hope you've enjoyed that look at Hushai, perhaps one of the friends of David that was less familiar, the only one called the friend of David in the record. Our series concludes with our next class, our 8th class. It'll be on Mephibosheth. It's a beautiful story of saving grace. And so my prayer is that you continue to read your scriptures, to read effectively, to explore the Bible. And I pray that as you do, God will bless you in your reading. And thanks for your attention today. Take care, and God bless.